pair of bolt cutters snapped through a rusted padlock. The padlock fell into the long grass with a soft thump. A woman in a denim jacket stood at the door of a small wooden smokehouse on a quiet hillside in eastern Kentucky. She did not open the door right away. She set the bolt cutters down on the gravel path. She wiped her hands on the seat of her jeans. She looked up at the sky, where a small flock of starlings was wheeling above the maple stand at the back of the property. Her name was Ruth Halloran. She was 58 years old. She had inherited the smokehouse a week ago from her late brother, who had died at the age of 63 of a heart attack in his sleep at his small house in town. The smokehouse had been padlocked since 1979. That had been 47 years. Ruth had not known the smokehouse existed until the lawyer had pulled out the survey map. The smokehouse stood on a back corner of an old family property that had once been a working tobacco farm. The farm had been sold off in parcels in the 1980s. The 2 acres around the smokehouse had been retained by her brother in a side deed that nobody else in the family had known about. Ruth had driven out from her own small house 3 towns away that morning. She had brought a thermos of coffee, a sandwich in a paper bag, the bolt cutters, and her late brother's old keychain in case any of the keys on it happened to fit. None of them had. She had used the bolt cutters. Now she stood at the smokehouse door with the padlock in the grass and the door unlatched and her brother 8 days in the ground, and she did not yet know that the wall of newspaper clippings, and the small wooden cradle, and the steel box of bank ledgers in her brother's hand were waiting for her on the other side of the door. She did not yet know that the knock at the back door of the farmhouse that evening would bring a woman in her early 30s who would look exactly like Ruth had looked at that age. Why had her brother kept a smokehouse padlocked for 47 years? Stay with me on this one. Ruth had been the third of 4 children. Her father had been a quiet tobacco farmer named John Halloran. Her mother had been a quiet woman named Bate who had taught Sunday school. Her older sister Marion had married young and moved to Cincinnati. Her older brother Hugh had stayed on the farm and taken over from their father in the 1970s. Her younger brother Tom had been the family's quiet one. Tom had been the one who had inherited the smokehouse. Tom had not married. He had not had children. He had worked 35 years as a postal clerk in the small county seat. He had lived alone in a small frame house on Maple Street. He had grown tomatoes in his backyard and played the guitar at the senior center on Wednesday evenings and read history books from the public library. Ruth had loved her brother Tom. Ruth had raised her brother Hugh's 3 children after Hugh's wife had walked out in 1989. She had moved into Hugh's farmhouse for 9 years. She had raised the children through high school. She had never had her own. She had not married. When the youngest of Hugh's children had gone off to college, Ruth had moved into her own small house in the next county over. She had taken a job as a bookkeeper at the local hardware store. She had grown her own tomatoes. She had read her own history books. She and Tom had spoken on the phone every Sunday afternoon. Tom had died in his sleep on a Tuesday in the spring. Hugh had called Ruth at 6 in the morning. Hugh's voice on the phone had been steady. Ruth had driven over the same day. The funeral had been small. There had been Tom's 2 co-workers from the post office, the librarian from the public library, the music teacher who ran the Wednesday senior center band, and the 4 Halloran family members still alive. The lawyer had read the will at the kitchen table after the funeral. The will had been simple. Tom had left his house on Maple Street to Hugh's youngest, who had been his godson. He had left his savings account, which had held $11,000, to a hospice in Lexington that had cared for their mother in 1996. He had left his guitar to the music teacher at the senior center. He had left in a single line at the bottom of the will the 2-acre parcel on the back of the old family farm, including the smokehouse, to his sister Ruth. The lawyer had pulled out the survey map. Ruth had stared at it. "I did not know we still owned a smokehouse," she had said. The lawyer had nodded. "I did not either," the lawyer had said. Tom kept a side deed. The deed has been in his safe deposit box at the bank for 45 years. The taxes on the parcel have been paid every year by automatic withdrawal from his account. He paid less than $30 a year in property tax. The parcel was not listed on the original farm sale in 1985. Ruth had taken the deed and the survey map and the brass key to the safe deposit box and had driven home that evening. She had thought about the smokehouse all week. She had remembered slowly that the smokehouse had been somewhere on the back of the farm when she was a child. She had remembered her father curing hams in it in the autumn. She had remembered a small wooden door with a heavy iron hinge. She had remembered her mother forbidding the children to play near it. She had not remembered when it had been padlocked. She had not remembered her father or her mother ever opening it again after a certain year. Now she pushed the smokehouse door open with the side of her boot. The hinges groaned. The smell that came out of the smokehouse was not the smell of cured ham. It was the smell of old newspaper and damp wood and something faintly cedar. She ducked through the low doorway. The interior of the smokehouse was a single small room about 10 feet by 10 feet. The roof was peaked. A single small window high on the back wall let in a column of dusty sunlight. The floor was hard-packed dirt. The interior walls of the smokehouse had been papered, floor to ceiling, with newspaper clippings. She did not understand what she was looking at for a long moment. She stepped further into the room. The clippings were not random. They had been pasted up in a careful chronological order. The earliest clippings were on the wall to her left, near the door. The latest clippings were on the wall to her right, opposite the small high window. The earliest clippings were from the autumn of 1972. Ruth had been 4 years old in the autumn of 1972. The clippings were from the local county paper. They reported the disappearance of a young woman named Margaret Doss from a small farm 3 counties to the east. Margaret Doss had been 23 years old. She had been the mother of a newborn baby girl. She had walked out of her family farmhouse one September morning and not come back. The county sheriff had searched for 2 weeks. No trace had ever been found. The clippings continued for the next 18 months on the same wall. Then the clippings shifted. They were no longer about Margaret Doss. They were about a small inheritance trust set up at a bank in Lexington in the spring of 1974, in the name of a child whose name had been redacted in every clipping with a careful strip of black ink. The trust had been seeded with $20,000. The trust had been administered, the clipping said, by an unnamed party in this very county. The clippings on the opposite wall, beside the high window, dated from the 1990s and the 2000s. They were small ledger receipts and bank statements, not clippings at all. They showed the trust growing year by year. By 2007, the trust had held over $300,000. By 2018, it had held nearly $500,000. In the center of the back wall, on a wooden shelf below the high window, stood 3 objects. A small wooden cradle. It was a newborn's cradle, plain pine, with a soft folded blanket inside. A steel lockbox the size of a shoebox. The lockbox had a small brass key glued to the lid with what looked like wax. A label on the lid read, "To Ruth." Read everything. Tom's handwriting. Ruth set her thermos of coffee carefully on the dirt floor. She walked to the back wall. She picked up the steel lockbox. She carried it out into the daylight and sat down on the gravel path with the lockbox in her lap. She used the small brass key. The lockbox contained a thick stack of bank ledgers in her brother Tom's handwriting. The ledgers tracked the trust from 1974 to the spring of last year. Every deposit, every interest payment, every line item. At the bottom of the stack was a sealed envelope. The envelope was addressed in Tom's hand to Ruth Halloran. She broke the seal. The letter inside was 4 pages long. The letter began, "Ruthie, if you are reading this, I have died, and you have cut the lock off the smokehouse, and you have walked into the room and seen the walls and the cradle and the lockbox. I am sorry I never told you. I had promised someone I would not, and I am the kind of man who keeps a promise. The someone is now also gone, which is why I am writing this letter. Read it through before you do anything. Then take the time you need. She read. In the autumn of 1972, when Tom had been 15 and Ruth had been 4, a young woman had come to the back door of the Halloran farmhouse one September night carrying a newborn baby. Her name was Margaret Doss. She was 23 years old. She was bruised on the left side of her face, and her wrists were raw. She was wearing a thin house dress in a cold rain, and she had no shoes on. The baby in her arms was 4 days old. She had run from her husband, a man in the next county over who had been beating her since she had become pregnant. She had walked 7 miles barefoot in the rain to the back door of the Halloran farmhouse because Ruth's mother Bate had been Margaret's Sunday school teacher many years before. Margaret had no other adult in the world she trusted. Ruth's mother had taken Margaret and the baby into the kitchen. She had warmed milk for the baby. She had warmed soup for Margaret. She had given Margaret her own dry clothes. Ruth's father had sat at the kitchen table and listened to Margaret's story. At the end of the story, Ruth's father had said one thing. He had said, "He will come for you here." Margaret had nodded. Ruth's father had said, "We will hide you in the smokehouse tonight." Tom, 15 years old, had been sent out to the smokehouse with blankets and a lantern. He had spent the night sitting on the floor of the smokehouse with Margaret Doss and the 4-day-old baby, while his father drove around the county in the rain pretending to look for Margaret in case the husband came asking. The husband had not come that night. He had come the next morning. The husband had pulled into the Halloran farm driveway at 9 in the morning in a green pickup truck. He had 2 of his brothers with him. He had a rifle on the rack of the cab. Ruth's father had walked out onto the porch with his own rifle. He had told the husband that Margaret Doss had not come to the Halloran farm. The husband had not believed him. The husband had stepped out of the green pickup truck. He had not made it 3 steps before Ruth's father had shot him in the chest. The husband had died in the gravel driveway. The 2 brothers had not moved. Ruth's father had said, in the same calm voice he used in church, "Take him home. Bury him on your own land. Tell the sheriff he disappeared in the rain. If you ever come on this farm again, I will shoot both of you, and I will not regret it." The 2 brothers had taken the husband, and they had gone. The sheriff had come around that afternoon to ask about the missing husband. Ruth's father had said he had not seen him. The sheriff had nodded and driven on. Margaret Doss had stayed in the smokehouse for 9 days. On the 10th day, Ruth's father and Ruth's mother had driven her, with the baby, to a small Methodist mission in Tennessee that took in women in trouble. Margaret had been given a new name and a new last name and a small job at the mission's kitchen. The husband's body had been buried on his brother's land, as instructed. The sheriff had closed the file on Margaret Doss 2 months later as a missing person. The baby's name had been Alina. Alina had grown up in Tennessee under the name Alina Pace. Margaret Doss, now Maggie Pace, had remarried in 1979 to a kind, quiet farmer in Tennessee. She had had 2 more daughters. She had died of cancer in 2017. Alina Pace, now 46 years old, lived in Nashville. She was a librarian. She did not know that her father had been killed in a gravel driveway in eastern Kentucky in 1972. She did not know that the man she had called Daddy was not her biological father. She did not know that a 15-year-old boy named Tom Halloran had sat with her on the floor of a smokehouse the night she had been 4 days old. The trust had been set up in 1974 by Ruth's father with the help of a quiet lawyer in Lexington. The trust had been seeded with the sale of one of the Halloran tobacco fields. The trust had been administered through 3 generations, by Ruth's father until 1991, by Tom from 1991 until his death last week, and now, according to the terms of the trust documents in the steel lockbox, by Ruth. The trust was to be paid out in full to Alina Pace upon the death of her mother Margaret. Margaret had died in 2017. Tom had been preparing to make the payment all the rest of his life. He had not done it yet. He had been waiting, the letter said, for Alina to come home. Alina was driving up from Nashville this week. Tom had written to her 2 months ago, a single careful letter, signed with his own name, telling her that her mother had asked him before she died to give Eleanor a letter on her 46th birthday. Tom had said he had the letter in his keeping. He had asked Eleanor to come to Kentucky in the spring. Eleanor had written back. She would come on the 3rd Saturday of May. The 3rd Saturday of May, the letter from Tom said, was today. Ruth lifted her head from the 4 pages of her brother's handwriting and looked up at the gravel road that led from the Smokehouse parcel back to the old farmhouse. It was past 4 in the afternoon. She closed the lockbox. She picked up her thermos of coffee. She walked back down to the old farmhouse, which her brother Hugh now owned and rented out to a young couple who taught at the local school. She had a key. She let herself in through the back kitchen door. The young couple were away for the long weekend. She washed her hands at the kitchen sink. She brewed a fresh pot of coffee on the stove. She set the lockbox on the kitchen table. She sat down at the table with the 4 pages of her brother's letter folded in her lap. She waited. At 5:15, there was a knock at the back kitchen door. Ruth rose. She opened the door. A woman in her early 30s stood on the back step. She was wearing a dark green spring jacket and jeans and quiet leather walking shoes. Her hair was pulled back at the nape of her neck. She had Ruth's mouth and Ruth's nose and Ruth's gray eyes. She looked exactly the way Ruth had looked at 31. She was not Eleanor Pace. Eleanor Pace would have been 46. The woman on the step held out her hand. "I am sorry to be late," she said. "I drove up from Nashville this morning. My name is Eleanor Pace's daughter. Sarah Pace." Eleanor could not come. She had a small cardiac episode in March, and her doctor would not let her drive. She asked me to come in her place. She did not know what she was asking me into. None of us did. I have read your brother's letter twice on the drive up. Ruth stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said quietly. "The coffee is fresh." Sarah came in. She had a small canvas tote on her shoulder. She set it gently on the kitchen table next to the steel lockbox. She looked at the lockbox. She looked at Ruth. She drew a long breath. "I look just like you," she said. "I know," Ruth said. "If you're still with me, hit that subscribe button. Stay with me. This is where it turns." Sarah Pace sat down at the kitchen table. Ruth poured 2 cups of coffee. Sarah took hers black. So did Ruth. "I've been waiting in the car for an hour at the head of the driveway," Sarah said. "I did not want to come up to the house until I had finished crying. I am not done crying. I'm just done crying out loud for the day." She set the cup down. "I have a question," she said carefully. "You may not have the answer. But your brother might have left it in the lockbox." Ruth nodded. Sarah said, "My mother is alive. She has had a small heart episode, but she is going to live. Her doctor says she has another 20 years. The trust was supposed to be paid to her on her mother's death. Her mother died 8 years ago. Tom did not pay it out." "Why?" Ruth opened the steel lockbox. She pulled out the bottom of the stack of papers. There was a second sealed envelope at the very bottom of the lockbox that Ruth had not noticed in the smokehouse. The envelope was addressed to Eleanor Pace. Ruth handed it across the table. "Open it," she said. Sarah broke the seal. The letter inside was 2 pages long. It was in Tom's hand. Sarah read it. Sarah set the letter down on the kitchen table. She wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist. "He says," she said quietly, "that he did not pay out the trust on my grandmother's death in 2017 because he learned in the months before she died that my mother had spoken on the telephone to her aunt, who is my grandmother's sister, who is still alive in eastern Kentucky and who is named Lillian. My mother told her aunt on that telephone call that she had been told her whole life that she was the daughter of Maggie Pace and a kind farmer in Tennessee. Her aunt told her that this was not the whole truth. Her aunt said she would tell her the whole truth in person on the next visit, but she would not say it on the phone." Sarah looked up. "My mother never made the next visit," she said. "My grandmother went into hospice the next month. My mother went to Tennessee to be with her. Her aunt died of pneumonia 3 weeks later. The truth was never spoken in person. My mother has been carrying the half-knowledge for 8 years. She has not been able to ask anyone. She did not know where to look. Sarah folded the letter. Your brother, she said, was looking for her aunt's letter to her. He was looking for the will, the burial papers, the diary, any record of what her aunt had been going to tell her. He did not pay out the trust because he wanted to deliver the whole truth at the same time. He was still searching when he died. Ruth set down her cup. He did find it, she said. Sarah looked up. Ruth lifted the bottom drawer of the kitchen breakfront. There was a manila folder tucked behind the silverware tray. Tom had told Ruth on the phone 3 months ago where to find it. He had said it was Halloran family papers that should not be in Hugh's house because Hugh's renters might find them. Ruth had moved the folder over to her own house the next weekend. She had brought it back to the farmhouse this afternoon when she had come down from the smokehouse. She had not yet looked inside. She opened the folder on the kitchen table between herself and Sarah. On top of the folder, in Tom's hand, was a typed transcript of an oral history recording made at a Tennessee Methodist mission in 1979. The transcript was of Margaret Doss, age 30, telling the story of her marriage and her escape and her arrival at the mission. The transcript named the husband. The transcript named the 2 brothers. The transcript named the Methodist minister who had married Margaret to her second husband in 1979. The transcript named the older sister who had not been able to take Margaret in 1972 because of her own difficult marriage. The older sister's name was Lillian. The transcript was complete. Tom had typed it. He had transcribed it from the cassette tapes the Methodist mission had kept in their archive. He had driven to Tennessee 3 years ago for the cassettes and back to Kentucky with them. There were 34 pages. Beneath the transcript was a second document. It was a photocopy of a handwritten letter on lined notebook paper. The handwriting was unsteady, the hand of a very old woman. The letter was dated 4 months before Lillian's death from pneumonia. It was addressed to her niece Alina. The letter said that Margaret had not been the daughter of the man who had raised her in Kentucky. Margaret's true father had been a young Methodist preacher who had passed through the county in the spring of 1948 and who had loved Lillian and Margaret's mother quietly for 1 season. The preacher had been killed in a car accident on a slick road outside Knoxville before Margaret was born. Margaret's mother had never told her daughters which of them belonged to which father. Lillian had learned the truth only at her mother's deathbed. She had not been able to tell Margaret to her face. She had wanted Alina to know. She had wanted the preacher's name on the family record. His name had been Daniel Ware. Tom had found a death certificate. He had found a small obituary in a Knoxville paper from June of 1948. He had found a single photograph, donated to the Methodist Mission Archive by a retired bishop, of Daniel Ware standing on the steps of a small white church in Tennessee. The photograph was clipped to the letter. Ruth slid the transcript and the letter and the photograph across the table to Sarah. Sarah read the first page of the transcript. She set it down. She put her hand over her mouth. She looked at the photograph of Daniel Ware. She traced the line of his jaw with the tip of her finger. He has my mother's chin, she said quietly. Take it, Ruth said quietly. Drive back to Nashville tomorrow morning. Give it to your mother. The trust will be wired to her account next Monday. There are also 42 pages of receipts and ledgers in the lockbox that show every dollar of the trust for 50 years. Tom kept them in case anyone ever asked. No one will ask, but you should have them. Sarah did not move. She looked at Ruth. You are my mother's first cousin, she said. I am, Ruth said quietly. I did not know that until this afternoon either. Sarah reached across the table and laid her hand on Ruth's wrist. It was a small touch. It did not last long. Ruth's eyes filled. I will come back, Sarah said. After my mother has read the transcript. I will come back in the summer. I will bring her. The doctor will allow her to fly by July. Ruth nodded. There is one more thing, she said. The smokehouse. Your grandmother lived in it for 9 days when your mother was 4 days old. Your mother slept in a wooden cradle there. The cradle is on a shelf in the smokehouse. It is plain pine. It has a soft folded blanket inside. The blanket is the one my mother gave Margaret on the first night. She paused. Take the cradle, she said. And the blanket. Sarah's chin trembled. I will, she said. They sat at the kitchen table until full dark. They did not speak much. Sarah carried the cradle out to her car at 9 in the evening. Ruth wrapped the soft folded blanket in fresh tissue and laid it inside the cradle. Sarah set the cradle on the back seat of her sedan and buckled the seatbelt across it. She drove back to Nashville at dawn. Ruth stayed in the farmhouse that night. She did not sleep much. She sat on the porch in her brother Hugh's old rocking chair until the sky in the east began to gray. She listened to the dogs at the neighbor's farm bark twice and stop. She listened to a freight train pass on the line behind the maple stand, slow and patient, somewhere past 3 in the morning. She thought about her father. She thought about a man who had stood on a porch in 1972 in a cold September rain and had done the necessary thing without asking anyone for permission and had carried the cost of it to his grave without complaint. She thought about her mother. She thought about a woman who had taught Sunday school for 40 years to children who would never know she had once warmed milk for a stranger's baby in a midnight kitchen, while a wet, bruised girl drank soup out of a blue ceramic bowl. She thought about Tom. She thought about a 15-year-old boy who had been handed a lantern and a stack of blankets and had been told to sit in a smokehouse all night with a frightened woman and a 4-day-old baby. She thought about how that boy had grown into a man who had paid the taxes on the smokehouse parcel every year for 50 years out of his own postal clerk's salary, so that no one would ever take the smokehouse away. She thought about the small life Tom had built for himself in town. The tomatoes, the guitar, the history books from the public library, the Sunday afternoon phone calls. He had not married. He had not had children of his own. She had wondered sometimes why. She knew now. He had been raising a child his whole life. The child had never known. The child had grown up in Tennessee, thinking her father was a kind, quiet farmer. The child was 46 years old now and was a librarian in Nashville with a daughter named Sarah and a small heart and 20 years left on the doctor's clock. Tom had been her uncle. He had been her uncle from the night she was 4 days old. In the morning, she walked back up the gravel path to the smokehouse. She stood for a long time at the door. Then she took the wallpaper of newspaper clippings down, slowly, carefully, one careful strip at a time. She put each strip into a manila folder. She labeled each folder. She would mail them to Sarah Pace at the end of the summer. The afternoon was warm. The starlings were back in the maple stand. A chickadee landed on the doorframe of the smokehouse and inspected Ruth and flew away. She sat down on the gravel path. She drank the last of her thermos of coffee. She thought about her brother, who had kept a promise for 47 years. She thought about her father, who had stood on a porch in 1972 with a rifle and a steady hand. She thought about her mother, who had warmed milk in a kitchen for a stranger's baby. She thought about Margaret Doss, walking 7 miles barefoot in the rain. She thought about Sarah Pace, driving south with a small pine cradle in the back seat. She thought about a leaner Pace, who would open her front door in Nashville at dusk and would see her daughter step out of the sedan and would see the small pine cradle on the back seat through the open car door. She thought about the blanket inside the cradle. The blanket had been folded by her mother's hands in the autumn of 1972. The blanket had been carried on a 4-day-old baby in a smokehouse on a cold September night. The blanket had been folded and put away on a shelf for 53 years. The blanket was going home now, to the woman who had slept under it once and would not remember. It was enough, she thought, for the 3rd Saturday of May. It was enough.